And it's just after 1 o'clock here on a Wednesday. We welcome you to the ACSA Legislative Lunch Break, along with Edgar Zazweta, ACSA Senior Director of Policy and Governmental Relations. I'm Naj Alikhan, ACSA Senior Director of Marketing and Communications. Again, welcome. Go ahead and jump in onto the chat. Let us know where you're watching from. Say hello. Tell us what's happening in your region. Edgar, how are you today?
Good, Naj. Another Wednesday, another big Wednesday. Apparently, we only like to have shows when there's a lot going on, and obviously, that's
and you know what? That's why the members are tuning in, because they know if there's going to be something happening, it's happening on a Wednesday. Again, go ahead and say hello to us. Angela and Glenda have already said hello to us, and Jennifer, Terry Rufert, the superintendent over at Sundale School District, and our good friend Gary Reller over there in Riverside Unified. So hello to all of you. Big show for you today. We're going to talk about the governor's Safe Schools for All plan with the leader of that plan, and then Health and Human Services as well. So you'll want to go ahead and jump on board for that. Let's go through some news headlines. Of course, Edgar, it is Inauguration Day here. We did have Joe Biden inaugurated as the 46th president of the United States. And of course, California Senator Kamala Harris, now the vice president, the first female vice president. I know that you had an opportunity to take in some of the inauguration as I did, as I'm sure many of our members did. But because you've walked through that whole area, because you've participated in so many political events over the years, your reflections just on what took place today and what you heard from our new leaders.
Yeah, I mean, it's an exciting day, right? I think, and we see it just from the chats on everybody's mind, and it's a historic day for the obvious reasons. But in thinking about just what was transpiring today, it made me think. We on this show, for example, we talk a lot about sports, right? And that we use the sports analogy in many ways, and I feel like in many ways, Inauguration Day, and this is regardless of who's getting inaugurated. Inauguration Day always comes with that hope, almost like the beginning of a new season. Like no matter what happened last year, no matter where you were at, no matter how your team did, it's like it brings in this new hope. And I think there's this sense around the country that with the new president, it's all bets are off. We're starting from new. And I think the piece there that I think is important, and I think it echoes some of the president's remarks in his inauguration speech, is that we really like the sports analogy. We are a team. Unfortunately, too often, and obviously what we've been facing here in just the last couple months, it shows all the divisions. But here as Americans, we are one team. It's not a red team. It's not a blue team. We're all on the same team, right? And sometimes that's hard to forget. So I, at least today, have that renewed sense of hope and enthusiasm like we have at the beginning of a sports season, that It's going to be a successful one, right? And hoping that these 4 years for this administration are going to be good as Americans, right? As one team. And frankly, I feel that way no matter who's being inaugurated, no matter who you vote for. For the sake of the country, you hope that they're going to be successful. And I've heard that sentiment a lot today. So it does give me some renewed sense of enthusiasm and hope.
Yeah, enthusiasm. That's certainly what I was feeling this morning. We want to say hello to Brian, John, Charlie Hoffman, our president-elect here at ACSA, Brian and Ellen and Patricia. So good to have you guys with us. The inauguration of the president also means an entirely new cabinet, new leaders in every department, which brings us to the news that came out this week. San Diego Unified Superintendent Cindy Martin was picked to serve as the Deputy Secretary of Education in the Biden administration. Cindy's been a member here at ACSA since 2014, a member of our Superintendency Council, been at San Diego Unified as the superintendent since 2013. Edgar, as we have this news that came out, I want to ask you about the California influence that is over there now in the Biden administration. Beforehand with the education transition team, and now with Cindy Martin, who's going to be taking over that position as Deputy Secretary of Education. There is certainly a little twinge of California making its way over to the Department of Education, and that is certainly a good thing.
Oh, I couldn't have been more excited to hear the news. I mean, there's a sense of pride, first and foremost, and I think everybody as an ACSA member should feel that sense of pride. Cindy Martin, who's been an active member, who's been a superintendent now for a number of years, before that was a site administrator, and she is just passionate about this work. We get to work with her a lot, and those of us that have gotten to know her just know that her heart is truly in the right place. So I just think she's going to do great back there, and she's going to bring the right perspective to those conversations, to those policy decisions. But to your point, as a Californian now, I mean, this is going to look very different than the last 4 years, where we were constantly fighting, the federal government. Not to say we're always going to agree with them, and I'm sure we'll find some ways to disagree even with this new administration. But just between the vice president and now having this influence on the education side with Cindy Martin as a deputy secretary, I think we could just expect that our voice there is going to be heard. Not to mention on the education side, as we've talked about, Linda Darling Hammond was the chair of the president-elect's at the time transition team. So I think California perspectives are going to be very well represented with the new administration.
Yeah, something to look forward to, certainly. Want to say hello to our valued viewers, Mary Lim and Therese, and Scott Smith, the great communications leader over at ABC Unified. So good to have you guys here. Edgar, before we get to our guests, I did want to bring attention to this, and this is now on the ACSA Resource Hub. You can read it there, content.axa.org. This is the coalition letter, Edgar, that we talked about just briefly last week, that all of the Education Coalition was putting together about this Safe Schools for All plan that the governor has come out with. Can you just provide a little bit of context as we move in towards our guests for this letter? And then, of course, our members can read it over on our resource hub. No,
we encourage everybody to take a look at the letter. It's a letter that we did in collaboration with some of our other statewide partners, CSBA, CSESA, CASBO, the Small School Districts Association. And we were joking with our guest here, where we have representatives from the administration. So it's kind of funny that in this letter, we say what we like, but we're also very honest about what are some of the concerns we have with the governor's incentive plan. And I think it's in that spirit that we sent the letter of really trying to state, here are the things that we think are going to be helpful. Here are some of the things that you might consider in order to try to make this more viable to our folks, with the ultimate goal, which we definitely applaud and concur with the goal of trying to get more kids to in-person instruction as the health situation evolves. So I think that I encourage everybody to check it out. It really outlines kind of where our priorities are. And this is really based on some of the feedback, frankly, we've gotten through many of our meetings. Every week, we're seeing some of these questions or this feedback from you folks. So that actually helped us guiding some of the questions and some of the recommendations we make.
And folks, as we bring in our guests, and we're going to talk about this Safe Schools for All plan, want to make sure that all of you know, because we expect there's going to be a flood of questions in for our guests. So we really want to talk about, the health and safety guidance that's come through here and the testing. We know we're going to get a lot of questions. In fact, Edgar, I just want to tell you, here's how much we love our viewers. 2 hours before the show today, we got in a question from Petertown Region 2 president. We had a question hours before. So that tells you that our members are fired up and ready for our two guests today.
I guess we got to take Peter's question now, right? If he sent it 2 hours before, it kind of
you know what,
to not ask it.
You know what, Peter, we'll see if we can get to this question at some point with our guests. Joining us today, Dr. Naomi Bardach, who is the lead on the Safe Schools for All plan, also associate professor of pediatrics and policy over at the University of California, San Francisco, and Paula Villescaz, the assistant secretary of state, Department of Health and Human Services, also a school board member in the San Juan Unified School District here in Sacramento County. Dr. Bardach and Paula, thank you guys so much for being with us today. Let me ask you first, Paula. We know this is the second iteration of school guidance, and it's been in the works for some time now. Can you start by just letting us know what the guidelines were, how they were revised, and what really were the notable changes in these new guidelines?
Sure, I'd be happy to. And of course, completely welcome Dr. Bardach to jump in here too. But I want to just first, I say thank you both to you for organizing this opportunity to have this discussion, but also to the many school partners, administrators, other partners and allies on the, joining us today. Thank you for all that you've done. And I also want to say thank you for outing my second identity. I try to run around a little bit quietly, but I think it's probably the worst secret at this point. But shout out to my San Juan team for sure. And I think at the broadest level, right, our changes reflect both where we are in the current event. I mean, this event has really taken on many different stages and iterations. And of course, we have to ensure that guidance reflects and continues to reflect those changes, as well as really what we've learned about the science. So you'll see, there's some broad-based changes. What you will see in the consolidated guidance, which I should say is, 90% of that effort was an effort to put it in one spot, because what we heard from a lot of our partners was the guidance was a little everywhere, really hard to disseminate, exactly what should we be doing. And so while there's a lot there, know that 75% of it is probably the same. The rest really reflects that are necessary both because of the event and where we are in the event and health. And I'll invite Dr. Bardach to add anything else.
I think that was a great summary. The focus of the consolidated guidance is mostly to bring it all together. And then there are a couple key differences, one of which being the process to go through to do a reopening process for those people who are not yet reopened. And that includes a new COVID safety plan, which we can talk about more if people have more questions about that. There's also some changes. There's just more specificity around the physical distancing requirements. And then some changes around cleaning and disinfection, because we know from the earlier part of the pandemic, we thought disinfection was important, and the data now shows that it's appropriate if there's been a case in the school, but it doesn't need to be lots and lots of disinfection, which we thought in the beginning was going to be important. And then the other piece is also the testing piece, so giving a little bit more information about testing and different types of testing and different potential cadences and how to think that through.
Dr. Bardach, and thank you both of you for being here today. I think your inclusion now on this broader team is significant in itself, right? That the state brought in an emerging expert in this whole area around COVID and how it's impacting schools. And I know one of the things that administration has tried to do is put forth and raise up some of the emerging science that we've learned. That as the pandemic has gone on, we've had more and more information. Maybe just in general terms, do you want to highlight, maybe not specific studies or whatnot, but just in general terms, what have we learned around COVID and the transmission in schools since the beginning of the pandemic?
I'm really sorry. My camera cut out for about the last 10 seconds of what you said. Could you just ask that question?
I will summarize my question in short. First, I was bragging about you being an expert in COVID in school.
Thank you. I heard that part.
I was asking you if you could just summarize what have been the lessons that we learned about transmission in schools, and because I know that's one of the things that the administration has tried to prop up here in some of these discussions.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I think it's really important. And much of it goes to, there's a couple stages we're going to go through, one of which is, first of all, a question of, should we reopen schools or should we not reopen schools? That's kind of a binary question. But the answer to that question partly is, how do we do it in a way that is safe and effective? And so for the first part of the question, the science that informs us is basically that we know that kids tend to get COVID less frequently than adults. A lot of the transmission that we need to worry about in the school-based setting is actually the adult-to-adult transmission. So as we think about if schools are opening, as in any other place, what you really want to prevent is that on-site transmission of one case to another. So we want to focus on adults as well as students. People sometimes forget to focus on the adults because we're used to kids being the ones who get sick all the time. So that's one useful piece. And the other piece is that that the layers of mitigation are very, very important. We can't just say there's only one thing we have to do. We know that actually it's that what they call the Swiss cheese model, which is that if you have one slice of Swiss cheese, there's a hole in that slice, or maybe multiple holes. But if you have another slice of Swiss cheese that's slightly different angle, then you can block some of those holes. So you need a couple layers of Swiss cheese in order to block the transmission of the virus from one person to another. That includes the masking. And we know what works from two different types of information. One is we see things that outbreaks that happen when you don't have the layers in place. And then we see also that if you have those layers in place, that you can have schools open without a ton of in-person transmission. So those layers, you guys are probably very familiar, but it's always helpful to say them out loud. Masking, physical distancing, stable groups of students, good hand hygiene, good ventilation, and then symptom screening and exposure screening, and then testing in response to that. So that's kind of the essence of it. And we kind of know it from a bunch of different types of data. We know it from international data. We also know it from local data. We have good data that just came out of North Carolina. There are a bunch of good CDC reports. And the last thing to say is that there's some reports that come out that make people very anxious because about it, they tell a story about an outbreak, or they tell a story about symptomatic kids who might have a high viral load. Those are studies that help us understand how to break the transmission. We learn from them about what not to do, rather than sometimes the media hypes them up as like, schools are going to be not safe. But I think it's really helpful that we can learn lessons from them, and we use those lessons to make schools more safe. Long answer, sorry.
Thank you.
And if I could just jump in really quick, I wanted to express my shared appreciation for Dr. Bardach team and her expertise for sure. Edgar, I think you probably know all of the degree I don't have, and I've at this point said multiple times, not a public health expert. So we were so thrilled when we did finally add a little bit to our bench of public health experts.
Paula, let me ask you, as your role as a school board member, San Juan Unified, you know that schools have struggled with keeping up with the emerging issues of this pandemic. What would you say to some of the school leaders out there, our viewers who are watching, who might be struggling with how they might be coping with potential changes that these guidelines may present?
Yeah, I just want to kind of offer a little bit of empathy. Like, yes, the conditions, and it feels like the ground keeps shaking below us, and that's because it is. We're responding to a a very, very complicated and event that's just constantly in flux. But just know that we know, and I know, wearing my multiple hats, how much of a challenge this is. And if there's just one push that I would want to make is we want to make sure people don't feel like there's no hope, like particularly from my perspective. And so this is speaking as Paula Villescaz. Every week that we might be able to get of in-person learning is worth fighting and planning for. And so I think sometimes everyone probably has a lot more unanswered questions than they have answered questions, and we recognize that. And so we really are trying to be as responsive as possible. But my plea is don't give up. Continue to work with your community partners, your labor partners, your management partners, everybody that you can in conditions, even if it feels like you've been having them for a really long time. We're coming up almost, right? So there's just no doubt that this is probably the hardest thing that any of us in public education will have to do. But every moment of time that we can fight for our kids being back in class safely, we do that, and they deserve that much from us.
Dr. Bardach, one of the questions, and I know you've been hearing it, and I think actually both of you will be able to touch on this, is around the testing requirement in the guidance about what's required, what's not required. I believe it was Michelle who asked a question about opt-out. can students opt out? Because now the guidance does talk about supporting, and I want to make sure I get the wording right, supporting testing cadence for both students and staff. So maybe you could both of you could clear that up in terms of what is this guidance actually requiring in terms of testing, and maybe this question about how do we deal with student testing when LEAs are looking at that.
Mm-hmm. Maybe I'll take the first piece, and then Paula can speak a little bit to the how-to of the student testing. Both of us could probably do it, but there is no assumption that students will be forced to do any kind of testing. That's definitely not the intention of the guidance. There is an option for people to consider offering it to students, and that the cadence that is written out there in terms of asymptomatic testing is what the state is able to support with the Valencia branch lab, et cetera. And there is a range in terms of the evidence base. There's a range of how much asymptomatic testing can be done in order to sort of have a safe school reopening. Some people do it with very minimal. North Carolina had a paper in pediatrics very recently. They had very minimal asymptomatic testing. New York City has a sort of like a sampling of students and teachers that get tested in their lower risk schools, and a much more consistent larger groups in their higher risk schools in terms of community prevalence. So there's just kind of a range, and there's no expectation that a student would be forced to do it or that a staff would be forced to do it, but that schools could offer it to those populations.
Paula, anything you would add to that in terms of
And I'll just add a little bit to yeah, apologies, Edgar. I think there's just a little bit of a delay, but happy to add just a little bit more on kind of the practical implementation pieces. So I've been helping coordinate the work of the schools branch of the testing task force that coordinates a lot of the efforts related to the Valencia, which was the state's brand new lab, stood up in November. And a question I often get is, you wrote on paper, this is the capacity you can support. Is that true? And the answer is yes. Our doors are still 100% open. We've been a little bit on a tour, in partnership with both our county offices of education partners, but also in partnership with school districts directly. We're here to support that need. We've got roughly 130 LEA-based community sites that are currently testing within the Valencia branch lab, and have talked with at least 35 of our county office of education partners, and certainly pass on information related to those efforts. Office of Education office hours. We've got district office hours for our district partners, and then we also have kind of a 101 series on how to engage with Valencia branch lab. But know that is the state response to wanting to be as strong of a partner as possible to help ensure that testing is not come join us. Half the challenge is convincing folks it's as easy as it really is, but we've got a few peer validators that can as well. But know that we're here to meet your needs and stand ready to do that.
I'll add one other thing about the student part, because I know it makes people feel a little bit anxious. Particularly the younger kids. We did a study over the summertime in San Francisco looking at kids in indoor summer camps and testing them to try and actually, see is this possible to do it in younger kids. And we included kindergartners through 8th graders. And the way we did is we actually did what's called supervised self-collection, where the students are 6 feet away and they get the swab in their hand, they get that cotton, Q-tip type thing in their hand, and then they do their own sampling. And it ends up actually working quite well. If the kids hold it, they're actually more comfortable than an adult putting something in their nose, actually. And, I like to joke, kids are pretty good at putting things in their noses. And so they're shockingly good at self-testing, actually. And so just to reassure people, I know there's a lot of anxiety around like, oh my God, student testing, that's a big deal. But if you do that kind of approach, is actually quite effective. And we actually had parents who initially, when they heard about it in our indoor camp study, they're like, I'm not going to do that. And we offered it to the parents, we offered it to the students, and we offered it to the staff. once they heard that it was actually just front of the nose, self-collected, the parents were comfortable with their kids doing it, and the parents were comfortable doing it themselves. So I think that it's sort of how you do it, and helping people understand that that's what the option is, can help actually have the uptake and have a lot less kind of resistance to it.
Yeah, that's a really interesting strategy. I can appreciate that. Edgar and I both have daughters, and he has a son, and I think I can appreciate that strategy of handing it off to our child. Let me ask you.
My son is definitely good at putting things in his nose, so that would work. So.
As every parent can attest.
Dr. Bardach, we have two very similar questions. This one came in from Craig Tammy Gensler about where educators are right now on the list of where the vaccinations come in. But I'll also ask that through Peter Town, who's our Region 2 president, about priority list for vaccines. Have educators moved down the list? Because now there are more vaccinations open for people 65 and older. How are educators moving up and down that list now?
Good question. It's vaccines is really a moving target. And even in our guidance, we said, here's a placeholder basically for vaccines because it's moving so rapidly. And the issue right now is actually a little bit of a supply issue. So part of what happened with the last week, there was a change to say a little bit more emphasis on the 65 plus. And that was actually reflecting federal guidance saying everybody needs to start focusing on 65 plus. And if you don't get out all your vaccines, then you're not going to be able to get as much in the next round. And so that between those two messages, I think that moved things a little bit more for the 65 plus in order for the long run to be able to get more of that vaccine. So that's my understanding of that dynamic. Educators are still an extraordinarily high priority, right? When we think about how we mitigate the effects, the bad effects of COVID-19, there's direct health effects, and then there's indirect health effects mediated through school closures and distance learning and inequity. And so educators are a high priority. I think, it's just important for us to keep on remembering that and creating systems that reflect that.
Paula, I'll start with you. A question that we got from one of our personal favorite members, Terry Rupert, one of our ACSA leaders. She asked this question, and I'm actually going to generalize it. She asked about the change and Dr. Bardach could touch on this too, changing the quarantine timeline from 14 to 10 days, and that parents may ask about the change. One of the other pieces that we get this frequent question is about the physical distancing requirements, that now it's a little bit more spelled out. From the 6 feet, if practicable, I think was the old language, to now giving some parameters of 4 to 6 feet. The bottom line question is, okay, if we're a school that's been open and we've been doing things successfully and we haven't had outbreaks, is the expectation that they have to go back and change whatever they're doing at the moment? Both of you can talk about that. I'll start with Paula.
Sure, and I'll start, pretty high level, and it's that those changes and a number of our changes reflect keeping up with both CDC guidance and other experts. This event is really, really tough because just when you think you've got something figured out, right, we learn a little bit more about how the virus reacts or how it behaves or how individuals might respond to it depending on age and other conditions. And so I can just certainly kind of appreciate the frustration that comes with having a bit of a moving target, and just know that that's nothing that we wish upon any of our schools or our school and education years, but those changes are often reflect the best that we know about the virus. And I'll let Dr. Bardach add in on any specifics.
No, I think that's about right. The issue around needing to respond to those, it's probably the thing that is the biggest change is the 4 feet of physical distancing. And that really does reflect the data that shows that if you have a high density of students in a classroom, it's much, much easier to have that transmission happen. And so, when the language only said 6 feet as practicable, sometimes people took the as practicable to say we don't have to do any distancing. And so it's a combination of distance between students, but then also density of people in the classroom. The high density classrooms have more chance of just any individual, multiple individuals coming in with COVID. And then also it's just easy, they're just more viral particles than in the air. And it's easier to pass around to a larger group of people. So those are the real reasons for it. And I think, as Paula really eloquently said, we recognize it's hard. This pandemic is hard, and we want to make sure we respond to keep people safe to what we understand in the data.
Dr. Bardach, because and you mentioned it, maybe I'll just have a quick follow-up, because I know this is related also to the COVID safety plans and kind of the role of still working with your local county health officer with whatever you may have in place, right? And because again, going back to these schools that may have already been open, since we haven't touched on that, do you just want to say a piece on the COVID safety plan and what the expectation is there for schools that either are open or planning to open?
I think I can say that briefly. So the COVID safety plan is two different pieces. It's the Cal-OSHA prevention plan that most people have already put together because they're, responding to the emergency regulations at the end of November, beginning of December. So that's one piece of it. The other piece is the checklist that just got the school's guidance checklist that just got posted also on Thursday with the new guidance. It's on that school's hub. It's right under checklist. It's a relatively straightforward checklist, and it basically just mostly you're checking off the boxes. It just has a couple individual things that you fill in, to say what is your testing plan, how many students are in your stable groups, and then what is your physical distancing. But those are the goal is to make it not too much of a burden for anybody who's already open. We tried to do it as clarity and consistency and transparency, but also not too much burden.
Dr. Bardach, let me ask you this question that's coming from Gary Reller, and it's a data question that I hear a lot of people asking. Gary asks, my understanding in Riverside County that secondary schools will not be able to return to in-person instruction until the case rates are 7 per 100,000. Is this different in other counties? And if so, why? Secondary schools, what can you give us what that data point is before they can safely reopen for in-person?
It is that 7 per 100,000. It should be the same across all counties because it's a California-wide guidance. But if people know something other, that would be great to know about.
Sorry, my turn. Sorry. One more question for me. Sorry, the delay got me there. Let me ask you now, kind of turning the corner. I think we all started this year with a little bit of expectation that things are getting better, right? And listening to Dr. Galley here over the last couple of days and Dr. Pond kind of showing some of those markers where things are getting a little bit better, I think makes this conversation about reopening that much more pertinent as things improve. Now, the one issue that's in everybody's concern, I know the other set of headlines that's been coming out is this new variant, or maybe variants, right? That in plural, whether it be the UK one or other ones. Just since both of you are kind of in the know, what's the latest on that front? And how should folks be thinking about that as they're thinking about now reopening later this spring, or even as we look beyond here this year? How is the discussion about these new variants in the context of the vaccines really impacting things? We'll start with Paula.
Sure, I'll get that kicked off, and this is gonna come wearing a little bit more of my school board hat. And again, I have a Post-it note that sits right here on my desk, and it says there are just good decisions. And so at the end of the day, we need to keep moving, in a responsible fashion with the information that. And so I know, particularly listening to such as the variants popping up, and as we learn more about that, it can be pretty intimidating and also just, frightening and a little bit weary, cause a little bit weary. But I think that can't stop us from moving forward with known information that we have now. And so, it's something that we obviously continue to monitor very aggressively from the state perspective, and will continue to do so. And again, this is where I'll just emphasize, if we need to then go back and change anything accordingly, we will. And that's where we ask again for some patience and understanding, and from everyone on the ground and throughout the state, to know that, again, we're not moving any goalposts intentionally. We're not trying to make it difficult. We're just running to the most known information. And so I continue to monitor it as everybody has, but I advise folks don't get paralyzed into indecision or inaction. I think there's still some room for preparation and planning, if not starting to sort of gradually reopen where the local conditions allow. And I would just encourage folks, again, listen intently to what's happening, but don't let it cloud every step and stop folks from making steps in the right direction. And I know that's difficult. I know it's a challenge. So all the ongoing work and the sometimes repetitive conversations, but strong partnerships and action is what's going to get us all to our shared goal.
Dr. Bardach, anything you would add, just as folks are concerned about, what may be to come?
I would agree with Paula. Where the most important part is to follow the information. So I'm following the information very carefully. The UK variant. There is some useful data that came out about it recently, just a couple of days ago or a week ago, from the UK, just to help people feel a little bit less concerned about it, or at least mitigate a story that some people might be confused about. The question was, are kids more likely to transmit this different variant? And the story is that the variant is more likely to transmit in general, both for adults and for kids.
Mm-hmm.
So, but it's still that relationship between the kids and the adults. The adults are still more likely to transmit it than the kids are. So I know that there was some concern initially about, is it different in the kids? And it's kind of acting the way COVID acts. I do think that we have to be very thoughtful and careful and ready to move if we need to move. Is there some way that we can increase what they call non-pharmaceutical interventions, the testing or the masking or the physical distancing or something, if we need to? Right now, there's no clear data that says, oh yes, we need to make a difference. But I think, I make a commitment, and you guys probably know that I'm a data and evidence person, and I am following it closely. And if we need to do something, then we'll communicate with people and talk to people about it.
Folks, let me give you a couple of things that Gianna Miller is going to go ahead and throw into our comment sections for you. First one is the new hub for the Safe Schools for All plan. You can access that, schools.covid19.ca.gov. Also, coming up today at 4 o'clock, Dr. Bardach is going to be joining CCEE for a webinar on this plan. That is at 4 o'clock. Gianna is going to go ahead and put that into the chat as well. Dr. Bardach, when you are on that webinar today, make sure that Executive Director Tom Armelino over at CCEE knows that you wanted to be on this show before you were on his, just so you can deliver that message that ACSA is way more important. ACSA show is way more important, right, Edgar? Than that
we're going to stick to that. We're going to give Tom a hard time. We'll stick with that.
Paula and Naomi, thanks so much for being with us today.
Primetime education space. It's a big honor.
Hey, thank you guys so much for being with us today. We appreciate it.
Thank you, guys. Thank you for the invitation. Take care. Thanks for all that you do.
And there you go. Yeah, see, Edgar, we're gonna give Tom a hard time any chance we can possibly get. Edgar, anything from that conversation that stuck out to you as far as new information, as far as the health and safety guidance that's come out?
Yeah, I appreciate the administration making this effort to answer as many questions as possible with the different forums. And obviously coming on here today, Dr. Bardach's going to be on this webinar later today. There was a webinar last week, and I think they recognize that some of this is just going to be an information piece. I know we have a lot of questions about what's still required. Is there mandates for teachers or not? And I know that you almost have to repeat that over and over. And I think what makes it a little bit confusing is that there's the guidance, which we were talking about today, And then there's the governor's plan, which is an incentive plan, right? Which has slightly different requirements. In order to be eligible for those grants, they want you to do a little bit more beyond what's mandated in the guidance, right? So undoubtedly, I think this is going to be something we're going to be talking about quite a bit in the weeks to come. But I'm just appreciative of them trying to come on and give a little bit clarity on a number of these fronts.
Yeah, certainly news making in all facets of public education right now, and certainly of value to have that information. Edgar, we got through another Wednesday here. No breaking news during the broadcast, unlike the last couple of weeks.
I mean, getting a new president, I guess that there really shouldn't be anything that trumps that, on a given day. So yeah, I just appreciate our folks. And I know just because I saw in both of my kids' classrooms, and this is a shout out to all of our educators and our site administrators and their teams and their teachers. I'm just really appreciative of just everybody having this conversation about civics and what our kids watching. I had my first grader, watching the inauguration remarks. So just shout out to all of our folks just to try to make sense of the world, especially for our students as we're living history.
It would have been good if your first grader had come and run in during the show and pulled out your earpiece again.
I don't wear them anymore. Yeah, I don't wear them anymore. I learned.
Dad, here's what the new president said. Make sure you say this on air. Yeah. All right, Edgar. Good seeing you today, man.
All right. Till next time, Naj.
And thank you, folks, so much for being with us today. Enjoy the rest of your day. Enjoy the rest of your week. We'll see you next week here on the ACSA Legislative Lunch Break.